The history of parliamentary sovereignty, the idea of parliament is a very simple one, and it goes way, way back to the very beginnings of parliament in the early Middle Ages, and it's fully developed by the 14th century, that's the 1300s. And the phrase is very simple. It's used, interestingly enough, with a taxpayers' revolt. People saying, why on earth should we pay taxes for things that we know nothing about, and that we've actually had no direct share in endorsing? And the judges reply quite simply, everybody is bound by what is decided in Parliament, because everybody is represented there either in person or by their representative. So it's the medieval theory that what concerns everybody should be decided by everybody. And again, when we think about the Middle Ages, we tend to think of it as a period of natural absolute monarchy and whatever. This is simply not true. The Middle Ages had a very powerful sense of the common good, of corporatism, and of the need to involve people in decisions. And the English Parliament, and it is the English Parliament, is the outstanding model of this process. But it's very important to understand something else. We tend to think of parliamentary sovereignty as something modern, as something towards which we move, that it's a product of progress. In fact, the English Parliament is peculiar not because it's modern or progressive or changed very much. What's peculiar about the English Parliament is that it's very old, very entrenched, and doesn't change. Virtually every other European monarchy, of course, apart from Italy, they were virtually all monarchies. Virtually every other European monarchy had some sort of parliament. They're called estates, generally speaking. The French, the estates general and the estates of each individual province, or the actual territories, directly ruled territories of the French king. But they disappear. What's peculiar about the English Parliament isn't that it develops, that it simply survives. And we need to ask ourselves why it survives. The parliaments in most European countries in the late 16th and the 17th centuries disappear for the very simple reason they were a nuisance. They simply got in the way of good government. What is remarkable about England is that the Parliament is there to facilitate government and becomes part of government. And again, this really interestingly, this has got fundamental repercussions for modern theories of Parliament. Even intelligent people like Daniel Hannan say the duty of Parliament is to oppose. You will remember the function of Parliament is to oppose. You will remember that was the statement that was used by the Supreme Court to declare that Boris couldn't prorogue Parliament, which was, by the way, we may even talk about this, an absolute constitutional outrage. This is not true. The English Parliament is created, I referred to it as going back to the 12th and let's get this right, to the 13th and the 14th centuries. It's created by two forces. It's created by those who oppose royal authority, that see the purpose of Parliament as very, very much to oppose the power of the king. That's the aspect of it that goes back to Magna Carta, the great settlement of 1215, except, by the way, we haven't time to talk about this, but the Magna Carta that's really important isn't the Magna Carta of 1215, it's the Magna Carta of 1216 and the Magna Carta of 1225, but that's another matter. But the clear idea there of the limitation of royal power, and then that idea is picked up in the next generation by the great the great and the ungreat and the famous and the infamous Simon de Montfort. That's the opposing of royal power. But the man who is most largely responsible for the shaping of Parliament is not Simon de Montfort. It's not the great opponent of royal power. It's the man who is actually responsible for destroying Simon de Montfort, who defeats him in battle, and because, of course, he's regarded as a traitor to the king, has his dead body chopped up in four, as was the usual treatment of a traitor. That is the Lord Edward. We would now say Prince Edward. That's the heir to Henry III, who comes to the throne as undoubtedly the most aggressively intelligent, forceful, absolutist king of the Middle Ages, but it is Edward I, the man who had destroyed, when he was prince, the man who had destroyed Simon de Montfort, who fulfills Parliament. Why does he complete this process? Because it's useful. And it's useful in two fundamental ways. It's useful because, above all, it facilitates the process of collecting taxation. The English are quite unusual that through most of English history, the rich actually tax themselves. In most continental countries, and indeed there's a certain sense in which this is still true in Italy, for example, it's rather bad manners to pay taxes. Only people who can't get out of it do it. The English upper class were prepared to pay tax because they'd agreed to it, because it had been negotiated with them in Parliament. So one of the essential functions of Parliament is to pave the way for efficient universal taxation. And there's another point which again is very uncomfortable to the modern ear. Parliament is the development of Parliament, of freedom and of self-government are very closely associated with war. The kings who were most effective in the development of Parliament, that's to say Edward I and Edward III, they're great warrior kings. Edward I is busy creating an empire within Britain by successfully conquering the Welsh and by coming within a whisker of conquering the Scots. And on his tomb famously appears Malleus Scotorum. And the other great parliamentary king of the Middle Ages, this is the point at which the full modern parliament with a clear commons and a clear lords and a gradation of the peerage, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, barons, appears, is Edward III, of course, who is the king of the 100 Years' War and the war in France. So taxation for war is one of the essential features of Parliament, and again of the great glory age of the English Parliament after 1689, in the 18th and the 19th century, when Britain conquers the world with, above all, the British Navy, carried on the back of parliamentary taxation. But it's also, particularly with Edward I, it's law. It's the unique law-making body. So that's the origin of the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. It is representative of the whole realm, and it binds the whole realm. And then there are all sorts of debates later on, because of course you don't actually talk about parliamentary sovereignty. The sovereign is the monarch. It still is. If you actually look at the enacting clause of an Act of Parliament, it's still the sovereign force giving force to the Act of Parliament is the monarch. The clause declares, be it therefore enacted by, I have to remember it's no longer a queen, by the king's most excellent majesty, with the advice and consent of the lords spiritual and temporal and commons in this present parliament assembled that. In other words, the legislative force is the monarch. Is the sovereignty of the monarch. And when we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, we are not talking, and this is such an utterly fundamental misunderstanding, we are not talking about the so-called sovereignty of the House of Commons. We are talking about the crown in Parliament, and it's that complex tripartite body that is represented by the enacting clause, be it therefore enacted by the king with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled that. It's why Westminster, the Palace of Westminster, is still a royal palace. It's why there's a state opening of Parliament. It's why and all of that was designed by Prince Albert, Victoria's consort, who is very much in charge of the committee that is responsible for the rebuilding of the palace in its present Victorian form after the Great Fire of 1834. So it's the whole body incorporating the crown, which is the activator, and it's also, of course, the boundaries of what it could do do change, and the most important of the changes is in my own period of history. It comes with the legislation of Henry VIII, in which everything, including even matters spiritual and of belief, are to be decided by the English Parliament. You know, what is true Christian doctrine is still, although you wouldn't know it from the antics of the current Church of England, its final arbiter is Parliament. And as it were, the final perfection, the honing of the doctrine, is the late 19th century. Is the polish of 19th century constitutional theorists. But the essence of it, and this is the really important thing, is utterly embodied in the English psyche and the English way we've governed ourselves. And remember, that way, as I've tried to argue, is fundamentally historically rooted. It's not part of a developmental process and one of constant improvement. In fact, the English are unique in that they're the only people who've decided that progress was a mistake. We actually reversed a revolution. The revolution, the Puritan revolution of the 1640s and 1650s. And it's reversed without foreign intervention. There is a restoration in France, but it's actually imposed by the other European powers, led by Britain, with the defeat of Napoleon and the reimposition, for a time being, of the Bourbon monarchy. The English decide to do it for themselves. The Constitution, and this is the vital thing, which has been completely forgotten in all modern debates on the Constitution, our Constitution is fundamentally historically rooted. It is not a product of abstract theory, and that's why it lasts. That's why it's so good. And do you know what? It's even true, really, of America. America, okay, has got a written constitution, but it represents the lightest reworking of the tripartite structure of the English Constitution of the 18th century. And finally, all of this is even symbolized architecturally. If you look, well, let's go back to that building we were talking about. Let's go back to the Palace of Westminster itself, as rebuilt in 1834. The brief from 1834, the brief specifically said the building had to be in the Gothic or the Tudor taste. Classical buildings, domes, pillars, whatever, like Rome or Greece, were specifically ruled out because they wanted to make the point that our parliament, our freedom, and our laws are entrenched in medieval English history. They're not a product of the, again, everybody goes on about the Enlightenment. These are not a product of the Enlightenment. These are not a product of Enlightenment values. They're a product of something much more deeper, much more fundamental, dare I say it, in the soil, in the people. I better leave out the R word.